High on the untamed peaks of the Appalachian Range sits Blackwood Mountain, a place that local folklore treats with a mixture of reverence and fear. It's a vast expanse of old-growth forest where the fog rolls in without warning, a thick, disorienting blanket that can swallow the world in minutes. The wind here sings a constant song through the ancient pines, a melody that feels both peaceful and profoundly unnerving. It's a place where you can feel the weight of centuries, a place that holds its secrets close. On a crisp October afternoon in 2016, a small, sophisticated drone cut through this airspace. Its operator was Alex Carter, a 28-year-old nature blogger whose YouTube channel, Wild Horizons, was gaining a modest following. He specialized in exploring forgotten places, abandoned logging trails, forgotten homesteads, and the wild, untouched corners of the map. Today, his mission was to capture the raw, autumnal beauty of Blackwood's remote western face. "All right, everyone, you can just feel the quiet up here," Alex narrated into the microphone connected to his controller, his voice hushed with awe. "The air is different. It's heavy. They say this part of the mountain hasn't changed in 100 years, and honestly, I believe it." His drone soared over a deep, forested valley, a place cartographers had simply marked as inaccessible terrain. The landscape was a breathtaking tapestry of gold, red, and deep evergreen. It was perfect. And then, something unnatural caught his eye. A flicker of light. Through a small gap in the dense canopy, something reflected the afternoon sun. It was sharp, metallic, and completely out of place. Alex paused his narration. His first thought was that it was just a piece of litter, perhaps an old can tossed aside by a hiker decades ago. But this was different. It was larger, and it was deep within a ravine that no hiker could easily reach. Curiosity overriding his filming schedule, he broke the drone from its programmed flight path and guided it downwards, his fingers tight on the controls. "Okay, I'm seeing something down there, folks," he whispered, his documentarian calm shifting to genuine intrigue. "Just off the old creek bed. Doesn't look natural." The drone descended, its small propellers whining as it pushed through a thin veil of mist. As the image on his monitor sharpened, Alex's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a piece of trash. It was a vehicle, or what was left of one. There, wedged tightly in a natural stone crevice as if deliberately hidden, was the unmistakable shape of a Ford Explorer. It was dark green, a popular color from the mid-90s, now faded to a dull, mottled camouflage of its former self. Nature had begun the slow, relentless process of reclaiming it. A thick blanket of moss covered its roof. A young birch tree grew defiantly through a rusted wheel well, and its windows were opaque with 2 decades of grime and mildew. This was no simple abandoned car. This was a tomb. He thought he had found a piece of forgotten history, a relic of some long-gone traveler. He had no idea he had just reopened one of the state's most haunting cold cases. To understand the chilling significance of that discovery, the true weight of that moment, we have to travel back in time. Back 20 years, to a different world, to the autumn of 1996. Through the grainy, saturated colors of an old home video camera, the Miller family appears, a perfect snapshot of suburban happiness. There's Robert, 38, a high school history teacher with a gentle smile and a passion for the outdoors. He's seen patiently trying to teach his daughter how to cast a fishing line in their backyard, his laughter echoing as the line gets tangled in a rose bush. There's Linda, 36, a freelance graphic designer whose warmth seems to radiate through the old tape. She's orchestrating Chloe's 10th birthday party, held just a week before the trip, her face glowing as she presents a brightly frosted cake. And then there's Chloe herself, a spirited girl with 2 pigtails that bounced with every step and a gap-toothed grin that could light up a room. The videos show a family full of inside jokes, easy affection, and the comfortable rhythm of a life built on love. They were, by all accounts, exceptionally ordinary and exceptionally happy. Their weekend trip to Blackwood Mountain was meant to be a final autumn adventure before winter set in. Robert had rented a small, rustic cabin, promising his daughter they would hike, fish, and tell scary stories by the fireplace. On the morning they vanished, the weather forecast had mentioned a storm system moving in, but nothing severe. Their last known point of contact was a cheerful phone call Linda made to her sister from a payphone at a rustic gas station at the very foot of the mountain. She spoke of their excitement, of how Chloe couldn't wait to see the waterfall near the cabin. The gas station attendant, a man later interviewed by police, remembered them well. He recalled Robert's confident demeanor as he studied a paper map, and he remembered warning him about the mountain road. "It gets slick up there when it rains," the attendant had said. Robert had simply smiled. "Don't worry," he'd replied. "We love a good adventure." They were his last known words to a stranger. The road that snaked up Blackwood Mountain was, and still is, notoriously dangerous. It's a remote, winding ribbon of asphalt with no streetlights and treacherous, unguarded drop-offs. Locals knew to respect it, especially when the weather turned. That evening, the predicted storm arrived with a vengeance, unleashing a torrent of rain that turned the road into a slick, muddy track. When the Millers failed to check in the next day, their family wasn't immediately worried. They assumed the storm had knocked out the phone lines. But when another day passed with only silence, a quiet unease curdled into genuine fear. The search that followed was one of the largest in the county's history. For 2 agonizing weeks, over 100 professional rescuers and local volunteers combed the dense forests. They rappelled into ravines, dragged the icy creeks, and flew helicopters over the canopy until the fuel ran low. They found nothing. Not a single piece of wreckage. No broken guardrails. No tire tracks skidding off into the abyss. It was as if the family's Ford Explorer had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The lead sheriff at the time, a man now long retired, spoke to reporters with a heavy heart as the official search was scaled down. "It's the mountain," he'd said, his face etched with frustration and sorrow. "It's a big place, a wild place. The ravines are deep. We have to assume they went off the road somewhere in the storm, and the mountain just took them." With no leads and no wreckage, the case inevitably went cold. The files were boxed up, the volunteers went home, and the Miller family's tragedy slowly faded from the headlines. Over the years, it became a part of the local Loria ghost story, whispered to new generations, a somber warning about the power of the mountain and the secrets it keeps. A mystery, sealed by time and buried by nature. Until now. The descent from Blackwood Mountain was a frantic, nerve-shredding ordeal for Alex Carter. The serene awe he had felt just hours before had been replaced by a cold, trembling urgency. Every shadow seemed to twist into a menacing shape. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep behind him. He clutched the drone controller to his chest like a holy relic, its memory card containing the single most important discovery of his life. The image of the green Ford Explorer, entombed in the ravine, was burned into his mind. He didn't stop, not for water, not for rest, until he stumbled out of the tree line and saw his truck parked where he'd left it. His hands shook so violently it took him 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. He drove, skidding on the gravel service road, not caring about the suspension, focused only on the single wavering bar of cell service he prayed would appear on his phone screen. When it finally did, a miraculous, solitary bar at a scenic overlook, he pulled over so sharply the tires squealed. He took a deep, shuddering breath and dialed 911. 911? What is the location of your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, and jarringly normal. I'm on the overlook on Route 7. Blackwood Mountain. Alex stammered, his own voice sounding foreign to him. "I don't know if it's an emergency exactly. It's old. I need to report something I found." "Okay, sir. What did you find?" "A vehicle. A car. An old Ford Explorer, I think. It's deep in the woods, way off any trail on the western slope." Alex could hear the faint sound of typing on the other end of the line. "Sir? An abandoned vehicle is a matter for the non-emergency line," the dispatcher said, a hint of practiced weariness in her tone. "If you can get a license plate number, you can report it to the sheriff's office during business hours." No, you don't understand," Alex insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "It's not just abandoned, it's hidden. It's in a place a car couldn't possibly crash into. It's in a rock crevice, covered with branches. It's been there a very, very long time. I have drone footage, I think. God, I think it might be the Miller's car." There was a silence on the line. It was no longer than a second, but it felt like an eternity. The professional cadence was gone, replaced by something else. The name still held power in this county. The Miller family? The dispatcher's voice was sharp, alert. From 1996? Yes. Alex breathed, relief washing over him. I think so. The call was transferred immediately. Alex found himself speaking to a desk sergeant at the Blackwood County Sheriff's Department, retelling his story, his words tumbling over one another. The sergeant was more overtly skeptical, his tone heavy with the experience of dealing with ghost stories and local cranks. But the mention of drone footage, of a specific location, and the potent name of Miller was enough. He told Alex to stay put. A patrol car was on its way. 2 deputies, both too young to have been on the force in 1996, met Alex at the Overlook. To them, the Miller case was a local legend, a training academy anecdote about the dangers of the mountain. They listened with a polite, patient skepticism as Alex, his hands still shaking, showed them the footage on the drone controller's small sun-glared screen. They saw the sweeping vistas, then the sudden dive, the shaky, pixelated image of something green and rusted. It's hard to tell what we're looking at, sir, the younger deputy said, squinting. I know, the screen is small, Alex said, frustrated, but look at the position. See how it's tucked under that rock ledge? A car doesn't just land there. The older deputy leaned in closer. He had grown up here. He'd heard the stories his whole life. He replayed the clip, his eyes narrowed in concentration. That color, he said, almost to himself. The official report said forest green. And that's a mid-90s Explorer, for sure. My dad had one. He looked up from the screen, first at his partner, then at Alex. The skepticism in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by the dawning heavy weight of professional gravity. He pulled out his radio. The call he made was not to request a tow truck, but to the personal cell phone of Sheriff Frank Thompson. For Sheriff Thompson, the news landed like a physical blow. He was a rookie deputy back in '96, a fresh-faced kid who had spent 10 exhausting days combing these same woods, his heart breaking for the lost little girl, Chloe. The failure of that search had been a defining moment of his early career, a lesson in humility at the hands of the mountain. He listened intently on the phone, his gaze distant. After a moment of silence, he gave a series of quiet, firm commands. He was mobilizing the county's best. The lead detective for major crimes, the full forensics unit, and the seasoned mountain rescue team who knew Blackwood's treacherous terrain better than anyone. This would not be a false alarm. It couldn't be. The next morning, a convoy of official vehicles made its way up the winding mountain road. The mood was somber, tense with anticipation. They parked where the asphalt ended, transferring gear to 4X4S that could handle the rugged service trails. But soon, even those became useless. The final leg of the journey was on foot. The trek was grueling. The team, a mix of grim-faced detectives in hiking boots and young forensic techs laden with heavy cases, followed a grizzled mountain rescue volunteer who hacked a path through the dense undergrowth with a machete. There was no trail here. The air grew colder, the forest floor, a tangled mess of roots and fallen trees. The silence was absolute, broken only by their own labored breathing and the rhythmic swing of the machete. It was a place of profound isolation, a place that felt hostile to human presence. It took them nearly 2 hours to travel a single mile. Finally, their guide stopped, pointing with his blade towards a steep, rocky ravine. This is it, he said. He said it was down there. The team gathered at the edge, their professional composure momentarily faltering as they looked down. It was real. There, exactly as the drone footage had shown, was the Ford Explorer. From this vantage point, it looked like a crushed toy, a forgotten relic in a dragon's lair. It was more chilling, more permanent than any screen could convey. The lead investigator, Detective Harding, a man with 25 years of experience, directed the operation with quiet authority. Ropes were secured to thick anchor trees. Harding, clipped into a harness, was the first one to be lowered down into the ravine. He landed softly on the damp ground beside the vehicle, his boots sinking slightly into the mulch of fallen leaves. The rest of the team watched in silence from above, their radios crackling with static. Harding began his initial assessment, his voice a low, steady narration broadcast back to the team. Vehicle is a '95 Ford Explorer, dark green. Body is surprisingly intact, minimal rust given the time. No obvious signs of major impact damage to the front or sides. He ran a gloved hand along the driver's side door. He then moved to the side facing the rock wall, crouching down. His movement stopped. For a long moment, he was silent. "Harding, what do you see?" Sheriff Thompson's voice crackled over the radio. Another pause. Then Harding's voice returned, flat and devoid of all emotion. "Sheriff, you need to see this. There are branches, logs, piled up against the side of the vehicle, and rocks. They're stacked here, deliberately." He paused again, letting the weight of his words sink in. This car didn't crash here. This wasn't an accident. This was a burial. Miles away, in a quiet suburban town in another state, Ethan Hayes was finishing a custom bookshelf in his woodworking shop. At 46, he was a man shaped by a quiet, enduring grief. The disappearance of his older sister Linda, her husband Robert, and his beloved niece Chloe had cleaved his life in two. The 20 years since had been a long, featureless expanse of not knowing. He had never found peace, only a hollowed-out acceptance of a question that would never be answered. He was wiping sawdust from his hands when he saw the unfamiliar sedan pull into his driveway. Two men in plain, dark suits got out. He knew instantly they were cops. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "Cops at your door are never good news." "Mr. Ethan Hayes?" one of the men asked, flashing a badge. "I'm Detective Calloway. We're here on behalf of the Sheriff's Department in Blackwood County." Blackwood County. The name alone was a physical shock, a ghost from a life he had tried to leave behind. "They believe they have located the vehicle," the detective said, his words careful and precise. "The vehicle belonging to your sister, Linda Miller." The words hung in the air. The vehicle. Not them, not survivors. The cold, official term was both a confirmation of the nightmare and a denial of any miracle. For 20 years, Ethan's mind had been a prison of possibilities, from the mundane to the horrific. But the one thing he'd never truly let go of was the irrational, desperate sliver of hope that they had simply run away, started a new life, and would one day come home. The detective's words killed that hope forever. A torrent of memories, images he had suppressed for years, flooded his mind. Linda laughing as she tried to teach him to drive. Chloe, age 7, sitting on his shoulders at a 4th of July parade. The last time he saw them, waving goodbye from their driveway as they left for their final, fateful trip. The storm of emotion that rose inside him was overwhelming grief, white-hot anger, and beneath it all a single, terrifying thought. Now I'll know. The not knowing was over. The truth, whatever it was waiting for him. The numbness that had been his constant companion for 2 decades receded, replaced by a chilling, absolute clarity of purpose. He looked at the 2 detectives standing on his porch, their faces etched with professional sympathy. "Thank you for telling me in person," he said, his voice steady, almost detached. He closed the door, walked through his quiet house, and went straight to the closet in his bedroom. On the top shelf, covered in a thin layer of dust, was a dark blue duffel bag. He pulled it down and began to pack with a methodical, mechanical precision. T-shirts, jeans, a heavy jacket. He wasn't thinking, only moving. For the first time in 20 years, his path was no longer a circle. It was a straight line, and it led directly back to the one place on earth he had sworn he would never return to. It led back to Blackwood Mountain. The arrival of Ethan Hayes at Blackwood Mountain coincided with the transformation of the ravine from a forgotten gravesite into a major crime scene. Under the harsh, sterile glare of portable floodlights that cut through the encroaching dusk, the area buzzed with a quiet, methodical intensity. This was Detective Frank Harding's domain now. At 52, Harding was a veteran of the Sheriff's Department, a man who moved with a deliberate calm that belied a sharp, analytical mind. He understood that in a 20-year-old case, haste was the enemy. The forest had held its secrets for 2 decades. It could hold them for a few more hours while his team did their work. Every leaf, every patch of soil, was now a potential witness. His forensics team, led by the unflappable Dr. Anya Sharma, worked in a grid pattern moving outwards from the Ford Explorer. Their process was a painstaking ballet of modern science in an ancient setting. Photographers, their flashes popping in the twilight, captured hundreds of images from every conceivable angle, documenting the scene with an obsessive precision. Technicians in sterile white coveralls knelt on the damp earth, carefully collecting soil samples, bagging fallen leaves, and using electrostatic lifters to search for infinitesimal fibers on the tree bark near the car. They were searching for an anomaly, a single thread of polyester, a flake of paint, a particle of anything that did not belong in this isolated patch of wilderness. Harding watched them, knowing the odds were astronomical after 20 winters of rain and snow, but knowing, too, that it had to be done. Procedure was the bedrock of justice. Dr. Sharma and a junior technician focused their attention on the vehicle itself. It was a metal time capsule, and opening it was a delicate operation. "Let's start with the exterior," Sharma instructed, her voice crisp and clear. "Full sweep for prints on the windows and door handles first." I know," she added, anticipating the tech's thought, "but we do it by the book. Then we'll check the seals, see if the interior has been protected from the elements." They dusted the grimy surfaces with black magnetic powder. As expected, the years of moisture and decay had erased any usable prints from the outside. But the door seals, compressed for 2 decades, had held remarkably well. The air inside the Explorer was stale, musty, but largely dry. The interior was a frozen moment in time. Harding peered through the driver's side window as Sharma's team illuminated the inside with powerful flashlights. "What are we seeing, Anya?" he asked. "What we're not seeing, Frank," she replied, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet ravine. She pointed her light at the steering column. "The ignition is off. Keys are not present. More importantly, look at the dashboard. Airbags are undeployed. The windshield has no cracks, no stress fractures. There's no cabin intrusion, no deformation of the A-pillar." She moved her light to the seatbelts. "Mechanisms aren't locked. No friction burns or stress marks on the webbing." Harding absorbed the information, his mind processing the implications. So, Sharma concluded, looking up at him, "this car didn't crash. It wasn't involved in any significant collision. It was driven here, put in park, and turned off." The official theory, the one that had closed the case 20 years ago, had just been professionally and unequivocally dismantled. This was not a tragic accident. This was a staged scene. The team managed to open the passenger door with minimal force. The air that escaped smelled of old upholstery, stale coffee, and something faintly sweet, like dried potpourri. It was the smell of a family car, preserved in the dark. The contents told a story of a life interrupted. In a side pocket, Linda Miller's purse contained a wallet with $73 in cash and a half-dozen credit cards, a checkbook, a tube of lipstick, a half-finished crossword puzzle torn from a newspaper. On the passenger seat, a road map of the state was still folded to the page for Blackwood County. In the back, a duffel bag was filled with neatly folded clothes for a weekend trip. Another bag held Robert's fishing gear, his favorite lures still in their plastic case. Chloe's backpack was there too, containing a worn copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a bag of candy, and a set of colored pencils. Harding surveyed the items as they were carefully catalogued and bagged. Robbery wasn't the motive, he stated, the words hanging in the cold night air. Whoever had brought this family here wasn't interested in their money or their possessions. Their motive was the family itself. The first truly unsettling discovery came from the back seat. A young technician, a woman named Sarah, was tasked with documenting Chloe's area. She noted the backpack, the book, and a small pink fleece blanket lying on the seat. As she reached down to collect the blanket, she felt something hard underneath it. Carefully, she lifted the fleece, and then she froze. "Dr. Sharma," she called out, her voice barely a whisper, "you need to see this." Sharma and Harding moved to the open door. There, on the seat where a 10-year-old girl had last sat, was an object so alien, so jarringly out of place, it seemed to suck the air out of the space around it. It was a doll, about a foot tall, carved from a single dark piece of wood, perhaps walnut or oak. It was primitive, almost brutish in its design. The limbs were disproportionately long and stick-like, the torso a simple block. But the most disturbing feature was its head. It had no carved eyes, no nose, no mouth. It was a smooth, featureless knob of wood, polished by hands to a dull, unsettling sheen. It was an effigy, not a toy. "Check the photos from the family," Harding ordered quietly. "See if she owned anything like this." "I don't need to check, Frank," Sharma said, her eyes fixed on the object. "She used sterile tongs to gently pick it up. Look at the tooling marks, the materials. This isn't a mass-produced toy. This is folk art, handmade, and it feels old." She placed it carefully into a large evidence bag. The plastic crinkled around the silent, wooden figure. The question hung unspoken between them. Who would leave this here? Was it a gift? A calling card? A signature? The work continued through the night and into the next day. The sun rose, casting long shadows across the ravine and offering little warmth. The recovery team had arrived, a crew of specialists with a heavy-duty winch and a mobile crane, which they painstakingly assembled on the ridge above. The process of extracting the Explorer was slow and methodical. Thick straps were carefully maneuvered under the vehicle's chassis, the team ensuring the car would remain as level as possible to preserve the integrity of any remaining evidence inside. "Okay, take it up slow," the crew chief yelled. The winch groaned to life, its powerful engine echoing off the rock walls. Cables tightened, and with a great sucking sound of roots and earth being torn apart, the Ford Explorer lifted from its 20-year resting place. It swayed gently in the air, a pendulum of lost time, water and rust-colored mud dripping from its undercarriage. "Hold it there," a voice suddenly shouted. It was one of the younger deputies, who was watching from a lower angle. "Hold it! There's something on the undercarriage." The winch stopped. The car hung suspended, 5 feet off the ground. Harding and Sharma scrambled down to where the deputy was pointing. On the passenger side of the chassis, protected from the worst of the elements by a deep recess, was a large patch of caked-on dried mud. And within the mud, something had been etched. "Get me a soft brush and some water," Sharma commanded. A technician hurried over with the supplies. With the delicate touch of an archaeologist, Dr. Sharma began to gently brush and moisten the dried mud. As the layers dissolved, letters began to appear. They were crude, jagged, scratched deep into the metal with what looked like a rock or a car key. First an N, then an O, a T. The team above watched in absolute silence. All activity ceased. Sharma continued her work, her movements precise. An A, chi. Finally, the entire message was revealed. 3 words, scrawled with a desperate final energy. A message from the grave. Not an accident. A collective, audible gasp went through the team. It was a direct communication from the victims. A voice that had reached out across 2 decades of silence to tell its story. This single discovery recontextualized everything. They were no longer just investigating a crime. They were answering a plea for help. By the time Ethan Hayes arrived at the makeshift command post at the base of the mountain, the news of the message had already solidified the investigation's grim trajectory. Ethan's face was a pale, exhausted mask, his eyes red, rimmed but fiercely alert. He met Detective Harding by the hood of a patrol car, a collection of maps spread across it. There were no emotional outpourings. It was a meeting of 2 men bound by a singular, solemn purpose. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Hayes," Harding said, extending a hand. "I can't imagine what this is like for you." "I just want to know what happened to them, Detective," Ethan replied, his voice raspy. Harding spent the next hour walking Ethan through the initial findings, showing him the high-resolution photographs of the scene, the car, the untouched belongings. He then turned to the task of the investigation, pulling out the old, dusty case files. His office had already started the work of tracking down the officers and witnesses from 1996. Most of the calls were dead ends. Witnesses had moved away. Their memories faded into an unreliable haze. But one call bore fruit. Harding managed to reach the retired sheriff, Bill McGregor, now an old man living in a nursing home 2 states away. Over a speakerphone in their temporary office, McGregor's voice was thin and reedy, but his mind was still sharp when it came to the case that haunted his career. The Millers. Yes. Lord, I never forgot that one, he rasped. We searched for weeks. The terrain, it just eats things up. We always assumed they went into a ravine. We found the car, Bill, Harding said gently. It wasn't in a ravine. It was hidden. There was a long silence on the line. Hidden. McGregor breathed. Then the rumors were true. What rumors? Harding pressed, leaning closer to the phone. Folks who lived up there, not in town but on the mountain. Off-grid types. Hermits. People who didn't take kindly to strangers on their land. We heard stories back then, but they were like smoke. You could never get a hold of them. We called them the mountain people. We chalked it up to local folklore. Never had anything solid to act on. God forgive me. Maybe we should have. The call ended, leaving a new, chilling avenue of investigation open. Harding turned his attention back to Ethan, who had been listening intently. For the rest of the afternoon, Ethan painstakingly went through old family photo albums and his sister Linda's journals, painting a vivid picture of the family for the detective. He described Robert's meticulous nature, Linda's boundless optimism, and Chloe's personality. She was a kid's kid, Ethan explained, his finger tracing a photo of Chloe on a swing. She loved her stuffed animals, her Barbies. She was a little timid, actually, scared of the dark, spiders, things like that. This was the moment Harding had been waiting for. He motioned to an officer, who brought over a sealed evidence box. Harding opened it and produced a large, glossy photograph of the wooden doll lying on the car seat where it had been found. He placed it on the table in front of Ethan. "Have you ever seen this before, Mr. Hayes?" Ethan stared at the picture. His reaction was not one of confusion. It was immediate and visceral. A look of revulsion crossed his face. He shook his head, pushing the photo away slightly. "No," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "Absolutely not. Never. This is the kind of thing that would have given Chloe nightmares. My sister would never ever have bought something like this for her. It's ugly. It's wrong." He looked up, his eyes locking with Harding's. "Wherever that thing came from, it did not come from my family." Harding nodded slowly. It was the final, crucial piece of the initial puzzle. The doll was not a forgotten toy. It was a foreign object, a trophy, a calling card left by an intruder. It was the only tangible link between the Miller family and the person or people who had made them disappear. The central question of the investigation had now been honed to a razor's edge. The mystery was no longer just what had happened to the Millers. The mystery was now the doll. And the hunt had begun for the person who made it. Of course. Here is the first part of Act 3, written to a target length of approximately 2,500 words. This section focuses on the deep dive into the history and folklore of Blackwood Mountain, transforming the investigation from a forensic analysis into a search for a ghost. Act 3, Unraveling the Mountain's Secret, Part 1 of 2. The investigation into the disappearance of the Miller family had reached a critical turning point. The flurry of forensic activity in the ravine had concluded, and the focus now shifted inward, from the physical evidence of the scene to the intangible evidence of memory, history, and fear. The Sheriff's Department in Blackwood County had become a dedicated war room. The walls, once bare, were now a sprawling collage of maps, crime scene photographs, timelines, and autopsy reports. At the very center of this web of information, pinned to a large corkboard, were a dozen high-resolution photographs of the small, faceless wooden doll. It stared out into the room, its silent, primitive form having become the investigation's unsettling pole star. Every theory, every lead, now orbited this single enigmatic object. Detective Frank Harding found his days consumed not by fingerprint powder and DNA swabs, but by dusty boxes and the ghosts of the past. The doll was their only non-victim-related artifact. It was the key. But to understand the key, he first had to understand the lock, the mountain itself. Blackwood Mountain was more than just a location. It was a character in this story, one with a long and often dark history. He knew that the answers wouldn't be found in a modern lab, but buried in the county's collective memory, in the stories the town told about the vast, ominous wilderness that loomed over it. Working alongside him, a constant presence in the war room, was Ethan Hayes. The initial shock of his arrival had subsided, replaced by a grim, unwavering resolve. He was no longer just a grieving family member. He had become an essential part of the investigation, a living archive of the people at the center of this tragedy. While Harding provided the methodical structure of police work, Ethan provided the heart. He spent hours poring over his sister's journals, creating a detailed psychological portrait of the family for the detectives, highlighting their habits, their hopes, their fears. It was a partnership forged in the crucible of grief, a silent understanding between two men obsessed with finding a truth that had been hidden for 20 years. Their first major task was to trace the history of the land where the explorer was found. This work led them to the county courthouse basement, a dimly lit room that smelled of aging paper and forgotten time. For 3 solid days they worked their way through heavy, leather-bound ledgers containing property deeds and plat maps dating back to the turn of the 20th century. It was tedious, eye-straining work, a slow and methodical journey into the past, page by dusty page. On the 3rd day Ethan found it. His finger traced a line on a brittle map from 1952. "Here," he said, his voice low. "This is the parcel. It covers the whole western face of the ridge, including that ravine." He pointed to the corresponding entry in the ledger. The land, a vast tract of over 2,000 acres, had been purchased in 1948. It had only ever had one owner since. The name on the deed was Jedediah Thorne. The name Thorne was not unknown in the county, but it was spoken of in hushed tones, like a local legend. Harding and Ethan started a new line of inquiry, digging into public records and newspaper archives associated with the name. A picture began to form of a family that was deeply reclusive and fiercely territorial. Jedediah Thorne was a man who had, by all accounts, wanted to own a piece of the mountain to be left alone on it. He and his 2 sons, Elias and Caleb, were known for posting aggressive, no trespassing signs and for their outright hostility towards anyone who happened to wander onto their property, be it lost hikers or hunters tracking game. Harding found a transcript of an interview from a 1978 land dispute case, where a state surveyor gave a statement about an encounter with the Thorne patriarch. "You didn't just stumble onto the Thorne property," the surveyor had said. "You were escorted off. Old man Jedediah came out of the woods holding a shotgun, didn't say a word, just pointed the way out, his eyes. They were cold as stone. Like the mountain itself was looking at you through him." The discovery of the Thorne family's ownership of the land was a significant development, but it was still just a historical footnote. Harding needed to find a pattern, a link between this territorial family and other strange occurrences. He assigned Ethan a new task, one that would prove both heartbreaking and pivotal. He sent him to the local library with a list of dates and a stack of dimes for the old microfiche machine. The goal: search the archives of the Blackwood County Chronicle for any mention of accidents, disappearances, or unusual events on the western side of the mountain between 1980 and the day the Millers vanished in 1996. For days, Ethan sat in the dim light of the library, the machine's mechanical hum, a constant drone as he scrolled through years of flickering black and white pages. He scanned headlines about town council meetings, high school football games, and church bake sales, his eyes aching from the strain. He was looking for a needle in a haystack of normalcy. Then he found the first one, a small 2-paragraph article from June of 1988. The headline read, "Hiker Missing on Blackwood Mountain." A 19-year-old college student from the city, Daniel Carruthers, had parked his car at the base of the mountain for a day hike and never returned. The search was extensive but was called off after a week due to severe summer thunderstorms. The official cause was listed as misadventure. Ethan felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He kept scrolling. 5 years later, in the autumn of 1993, he found another. Couple vanishes during camping trip. A young married couple, Sarah and Ben Carter, had gone missing. Their car was found locked at the main trailhead, their gear gone. The search for them lasted 2 weeks before being suspended with the first snowfall. The sheriff quoted in the article suggested they had likely gotten lost and succumbed to exposure. Another tragic accident. Ethan printed both articles. He laid them side by side on the library table. He then pulled out a topographical map of the mountain that Harding had given him. He circled the location of Daniel Carruthers' last known trail. He circled the trailhead where the Carters had parked their car. And then he circled the ravine where his sister's family had been found. All three locations were within a terrifyingly small 5-mile radius. And that entire radius was dominated by a single massive parcel of land, the Thorne property. It was a chilling pattern of convenience. For years, the mountain itself had been the perfect culprit. Its reputation for treacherous weather and unforgiving terrain provided a ready-made, plausible explanation for anyone who vanished within its borders. It was a killer that could never be arrested, a silent conspirator that buried the evidence under a blanket of leaves and time. But now, it seemed the mountain may have had a human accomplice. Armed with this emerging pattern, Harding and Ethan decided to shift their focus back to the town's living memory. They needed to find someone who knew the Thornes not as a legend, but as people. They spent the next several days canvassing the small town, visiting the local diner, the old hardware store, the VFW hall. Their questions were met with a wall of polite but firm silence. The older residents, the ones who would remember, would nod pleasantly, but their eyes would shudder at the mention of the Thorne name. The Thornes? Oh, they kept to themselves, one old farmer told them over coffee, before quickly changing the subject to the price of feed. Best to let sleeping dogs lie, detective, another man advised them outside the post office. Some things from the past are best left buried. It was a sentiment repeated over and over, a clear, unspoken agreement that some doors were not to be opened. It was a silence, born of something deeper than a desire for privacy. It was the silence of fear. Just as they were about to give up, they got a lead. The waitress at the diner, a woman in her 40s, overheard them talking. She leaned in conspiratorially. "You want to know about the Thornes?" she whispered. "You need to talk to Martha Gable. She was the school nurse for 40 years. She knows every family and every secret in this county. If anyone will talk to you, it's her." Martha Gable lived in a small, tidy house on the edge of town, the kind of place with immaculate flower beds and a welcoming front porch. She was in her late 80s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen a great deal. She invited them in, served them iced tea, and listened patiently as Harding explained the renewed investigation into the Miller case. When he finally mentioned the Thorne family, she didn't flinch or look away. She simply sighed, a long, weary sound, as if a weight she had been carrying for years had suddenly made itself known. "I knew this day would come," she said softly, her gaze drifting to a collection of old photographs on her mantelpiece. "I always feared it would." For the next 2 hours, in the quiet of her sun-drenched living room, Martha Gable unraveled the dark history of the Thorne family. "You have to understand," she began, "the Thornes weren't just landowners. They were like mountain royalty, in a dark sort of way. They owned the wild places. They were a law unto themselves." She spoke of Jedediah, the stern patriarch, and his 2 sons, Elias and Caleb. Elias was the older one, strong, capable, just like his father. He was being groomed to take over everything. Caleb was different. He was quiet, sensitive, an artistic boy. He was always whittling, always carrying a block of wood and a small knife. She then recounted the event that shattered the family and, she believed, created a monster. It was when Caleb was about 12 years old. There was an accident on their property. A logging accident, they called it. A tree fell. Elias, the older brother, was killed instantly. Caleb was there. He survived, but he sustained a very severe head injury. Harding and Ethan listened, captivated. "What happened to him after that?" Harding asked gently. Martha's face clouded with a deep professional sadness. "As the school nurse, I saw him when he came back. He was gone. The boy who left that morning never came back from the mountain. The head injury, the trauma of seeing his brother die, it broke something inside him. He became sullen, withdrawn, prone to sudden, terrifying fits of rage. He couldn't focus in school. He grew paranoid, convinced people were watching him, talking about him. He dropped out within the year. The light just went out of his eyes. After his father Jedediah passed away a few years later, Caleb was left up there all alone. The mountain became his whole world, his kingdom, and God help anyone who trespassed on it. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Martha's story settling upon them. Ethan, who had been listening with a painful intensity, leaned forward. He had one final question. "Miss Gable," he asked, his voice thick with emotion, "you said he was always whittling. You said he was artistic. What kind of things did he make?" Martha Gable turned her clear, sad eyes to him. A look of profound sorrow crossed her features, a memory surfacing from the deep past. "He used to leave them for me sometimes," she said, "on the steps of the nurse's office at the school. Little gifts, I suppose. He made animals, mostly. Squirrels, birds, deer." She paused, taking a shaky breath before delivering the final devastating words. "And he made little people, little wooden dolls. They were always strange, unsettling. He was a talented boy, but he could never get the faces right, so he just stopped trying. The dolls he made never had any faces." The drive back from Martha Gable's house was steeped in a heavy, electrified silence. The world outside the windows of Detective Harding's unmarked Sedanthi passing cars, the neat suburban lawns seemed mundane, oblivious to the monstrous secret that had just been unearthed in an old woman's memory. For Ethan Hayes, the revelation was a seismic shock. For 20 years, the monster who took his family had been a formless, nameless phantom. Now, that phantom had a name, Caleb Thorne, and he had a signature. A small, faceless wooden doll. The abstract horror had become terrifyingly concrete. The confirmation didn't bring relief, only a colder, harder form of dread. It was the feeling of a hunter who, having followed tracks all day, finally realizes they lead to the mouth of a dragon's cave. Harding, for his part, was already processing the information with a grim, tactical focus. The years of quiet frustration, of a case file gathering dust on a shelf, had been ignited into a singular purpose. The historical mystery had just become a manhunt. "She's our credible witness," Harding said, breaking the silence, his voice low and steady. "Her testimony connects Caleb Thorne directly to the unique MO of our primary piece of evidence. It's more than enough to move forward." "So what happens now?" Ethan asked, his voice raw. "Do we just go up there and get him?" "Not yet," Harding replied, turning a corner onto the main road. "This man has lived alone on that mountain for most of his life. It's his fortress. He knows every trail, every cave, every shadow. Going in loud is a good way to get an officer killed or to have Caleb vanish into the wilderness forever. We do this quietly. We do this by the book. First, we build a complete profile. We find out everything the official world knows about Caleb Thorne. And at the same time, we find his home. We pinpoint his exact location. We don't move until we know exactly where we're going." The war room at the sheriff's department was no longer a place of quiet reflection. It became a hive of intense activity. Harding put his team to work, their mission clear and defined. He began by running Caleb Thorne's name through every state and federal criminal database he could access. For a man so reclusive, it didn't take long to find a hit. A single file from May of 1992. The charge was minor: criminal trespass and terroristic threats. Harding printed the incident report and read it aloud to Ethan and his team. The complainant was a deer hunter from a neighboring state who had gotten disoriented in a thick fog and wandered off the main trail. He had stumbled into a clearing where he was confronted by a man he later identified from an old DMV photo as Caleb Thorne. The hunter's statement, recorded by a deputy 24 years ago, was chilling. "He didn't yell or anything," the statement read. "That was the scary part. He just appeared from between the trees, holding this old rust-pitted axe. He wasn't big, but his eyes. They were completely empty. He stood there for a minute, just staring. Then he said, 'The mountain doesn't like visitors.' I tried to explain I was lost. He took a step closer and said, 'If you're still on my land when the sun goes down, the mountain will keep you. I've never run so fast in my life. The report concluded that the charges were eventually dropped. The hunter was so terrified by the encounter that he refused to return to Blackwood County to testify in court. The file was closed. For Harding, the report was a crucial piece of the psychological puzzle. It painted a picture of Caleb not as a raving lunatic, but as something far more dangerous, a man with a cold, possessive, and menacing calm. He was the self-appointed guardian of the mountain, and he had his own set of laws. While Harding built the criminal profile, Ethan was tasked with a different kind of hunt. Using a secure laptop in the war room, he began a digital search for a physical location. He accessed the county's newly digitized archives, pulling up the old plat maps he and Harding had first examined in the courthouse basement. This time, he wasn't just looking for boundary lines. He was hunting for a ghost's address. He painstakingly cross-referenced the decades-old hand-drawn maps with modern high-resolution satellite imagery provided by the state police. It was like trying to align two different worlds. The old maps were approximations, drawn before the advent of GPS. But Ethan was methodical. Using geological features creek beds, unique rock outcroppings, and Rigsasa's anchor points, he began to overlay the Thorne property lines onto the detailed satellite photos. For hours he scanned the thousands of acres of dense forest, looking for any sign of human habitation. Finally, he found it. Deep in the heart of the Thorne property, miles from any road or official trail, was a tiny anomaly in the canopy, a small, unnaturally square clearing. It was almost invisible, but it was there. At the center of the clearing was a tiny, dark rectangle, the roof of a cabin. "I've got it, Frank," Ethan said, his voice quiet but electric. Harding and the team gathered around the monitor. Using the mapping software, they calculated the coordinates. The cabin was located 3.5 miles northeast of the ravine, where the miller's car had been found, a long, difficult hike, but certainly manageable for someone who knew the terrain. They finally had a destination. The next morning, before the sun had risen over the peaks, a small, undeclared team assembled at the base of the mountain. There were no marked patrol cars, no sirens. This was a reconnaissance mission, not an arrest. The team was lean. Harding, Ethan, who had refused to be left behind, and two of Harding's most trusted deputies, young, sharp-eyed officer named Miller, no relation, and a seasoned, 50-year-old deputy named Griggs, who had been on the mountain rescue team for 30 years. They were armed, but their objective was observation. Find the cabin, assess the situation, and get out without being detected. They drove a county-issued SUV up the winding road, parking it in a hidden turnout a few miles from their entry point. As they stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, the forest was dark and silent. The transition was immediate. One moment they were in the world of asphalt and engines, the next they were in Caleb Thorne's world. They moved in a single file line, Griggs in the lead, his steps confident and quiet on the forest floor. He didn't need a trail. He read the landscape itself, navigating by the slope of the land and the position of the stars still faintly visible through the canopy. As they moved deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The woods grew darker, the trees thicker, their ancient branches blocking out the nascent light. A strange, oppressive silence descended, the kind that makes the sound of your own heartbeat feel like a drum. It was a primal quiet, and it put every man on high alert. Ethan felt a cold knot of fear tightening in his gut, a feeling completely alien to him. This was not the peaceful wilderness his brother-in-law Robert had loved. This was a place that felt actively hostile, a fortress designed by nature to repel intruders. His hand kept drifting to the small canister of bear spray on his belt, a useless but comforting talisman in this deeply human darkness. Harding, walking just behind him, was a study in calm professionalism, but Ethan could see the subtle signs of his tension. His eyes never stopped scanning the trees around them, his right hand never strayed more than an inch from the grip of his holstered sidearm. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the distance, caused them to pause, listen, and wait. Twice Griggs stopped them, pointing to strange markings on the trees, not the familiar blaze of a hiking trail, but odd, geometric shapes carved into the bark. They were territorial markers, warnings. After nearly 3 hours of grueling, silent hiking, Griggs held up a hand, signaling a halt. He pointed through a thicket of rhododendron. "There," he whispered. "Smoke." Ethan and Harding peered through the leaves. Faintly, almost invisibly, a thin, gray curl of smoke was rising into the sky from about 100 yards ahead. They had found it. They moved forward with tactical slowness, using the thick trunks of a stand of hemlocks for cover, and then they saw it. The cabin was a primitive, almost feral structure, built of dark, hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss. It seemed to have grown out of the forest floor rather than been built upon it. The roof sagged in the middle, and the single stone chimney was crooked. Yet it was clearly inhabited. Beside the cabin, a small plot of land had been cleared for a vegetable garden, its rows surprisingly neat. A large pile of recently chopped firewood was stacked neatly against one wall. The smoke from the chimney confirmed it. Caleb was here, or had been just moments ago. They crept closer, their feet making no sound on the thick bed of pine needles. The cabin was silent. There were no sounds from within. A single window, made of warped old glass, was dark. The wooden door was slightly ajar, a dark slit in the face of the structure. The team took up positions around the small clearing, their weapons now drawn. Minutes stretched into an eternity. There was no movement. Finally, Harding made a decision. He gave a series of hand signals. He and Griggs would approach the front, while Miller and Ethan covered the rear. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his weapon held at the ready. He reached the door, listened for a moment, then pushed it open with the toe of his boot. It swung inward with a low, mournful creak. The interior of the cabin was a single, dim room. It was sparse, the home of a man who needed little from the outside world. A simple cot with a wool blanket was pushed against one wall. A cast-iron wood stove stood in the corner, a pot of what smelled like stew sitting on top, still warm. Shelves along the wall were filled with dozens of glass jars containing preserved vegetables. It was a Spartan, self-sufficient existence. But it was the far corner of the room that immediately drew all of their attention, pulling them in like a vortex. It was Caleb's workshop. A rough-hewn table stood directly under the room's only window, the faint morning light illuminating its surface. The table was a chaotic landscape of wood shavings, carving knives of various sizes, and pieces of sandpaper, and on it, and on the shelves above it, and on the floor around it were his creations. There were dozens of them, perhaps more than 100, in every stage of completion. They were a menagerie of forest creatures. Squirrels carved with unnaturally sharp claws and bared teeth. Birds, their wooden wings frozen in a moment of frantic, panicked flight. Deer, their bodies graceful, but their carved eyes wide and vacant with a look of perpetual terror. They were skillful, but they were all imbued with a sense of pain and fear. And then there were the dolls. They were everywhere, little wooden people scattered amongst the fearful animals. Some were just crudely blocked out shapes. Others were more refined, with delineated arms and legs. But all of them, every single one, shared the same soul-jarring characteristics: unnaturally long, stick-like limbs, and smooth, perfectly blank, faceless heads. Harding slowly walked towards the workbench, his eyes scanning the legion of silent, wooden figures. On a small, separate shelf above the table, as if given a place of honor, sat a single finished doll. It was polished to a dull sheen. The dark wood seemed to drink the light from the room. It was identical in every minute detail: the type of wood, the style of carving, the profoundly unsettling Orato, the doll that had been found resting under a child's blanket in the back of the Miller family's Ford Explorer. They had found the monster's lair. They had found his signature, repeated over and over until it had become an obsession. They now knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, exactly who they were hunting. The mystery of the doll was solved. But as Ethan Hayes stared at the small army of faceless figures, a much more terrifying question began to form in his mind, a question that would now drive the investigation into its final, desperate stage. Where were the bodies of the people these other dolls represented? The discovery in Caleb Thorne's cabin was a paradigm shift. The air in the Blackwood County Sheriff's Department was thick with a heavy yet electrified tension. The faceless dolls, now photographed and cataloged, had confirmed the identity of their suspect. But this knowledge brought with it a formidable, dangerous problem. They had found the monster's lair, but the monster was not in it. He was out there, somewhere in the vast, treacherous wilderness of the mountain he called home a ghost in his own fortress. An emergency strategy meeting was convened in the war room. Sheriff Thompson stood before a large topographical map of the Thorne property, his face a grim mask of concentration. Around the table were Detective Harding, a pale but resolute Ethan Hayes, and the leaders of the county's tactical and mountain rescue teams. The initial instinctual suggestion was to launch a full-scale manhunt. "We have probable cause to bring him in," a young, eager tactical commander argued. "We can set up a perimeter, use K-9 units, sweep the area grid by grid. We can find him." Sheriff Thompson listened patiently before shaking his head. "Son, I was a rookie on the search for the Millers in '96. We had 150 men on this mountain, and we found nothing. We're not talking about a lost hiker. We're talking about a man who has lived his entire life in this wilderness. He was born in it, shaped by it. He knows every game trail, every cave, every creek bed. He'll hear our vehicles from 5 miles away. He'll see our men coming before they're even off the main road. We would be charging into his world on his terms. Best case scenario, he vanishes so deep into those woods we never find him. Worst case," Thompson's eyes darkened, "he decides to hunt us back. He ambushes a team, and I lose a deputy. I won't take that risk." The room fell silent, the weight of the sheriff's assessment palpable. Ethan, his hands clenched into tight fists on the table, felt a surge of raw frustration. "So what do we do?" he demanded, his voice tight. "Just sit here and wait? We know who he is. We know what he did to my family. We can't just let him stay up there." It was Harding who answered, his voice calm and measured. He stepped forward and tapped the photo of the wooden doll pinned to the center of the board. "No," he said, "we don't wait. And we don't go into his world. We make him come into ours. We've seen his workshop. We know his obsessions. He's not just a survivalist. He's a creature of compulsion and ritual. That's his weakness." Harding looked around the room. "We can't out-hike him, but we can out-think him. We use his own psychology against him. We set a trap." The plan Harding laid out was audacious, theatrical, and deeply unsettling. It was a piece of psychological warfare designed to exploit the very core of Caleb's pathology. The goal was not just to capture him, but to draw him out by recreating the circumstances of his original crime, to present him with an irresistible echo of the past. The plan was approved. The hunt had begun, not with a search party, but with a shopping list. The first and most crucial piece of bait was the car. Harding's team spent 2 days searching statewide databases and online classifieds before they found what they were looking for in a dusty junkyard 3 counties over. A 1995 Ford Explorer, its original forest green paint faded and peeling. It was a perfect match. They purchased it for cash and had it transported back to Blackwood on a flatbed truck hidden under a tarp. The next element was the family. Harding was adamant that the scene had to be as authentic as possible. A female deputy with a keen eye for detail was dispatched to local thrift stores with a list of 90s-era clothing. She returned with stonewashed jeans, oversized flannel shirts, and a child's bright pink windbreaker. 4 mannequins to adult, 1 child, sized, and a smaller one to represent a younger child if needed, though they focused on a recreation of the Millerswear procured from a recently closed department store. The team spent a surreal afternoon in the station's garage, dressing the lifeless plastic figures. They propped the father mannequin, Robert, behind the wheel. They placed Linda in the passenger seat, her head tilted slightly as if in conversation. And in the back they placed Chloe, her small form partially covered by the same type of pink fleece blanket that had been found at the real scene. The result was profoundly disturbing. Silent, plastic family, frozen on the brink of a manufactured tragedy. While the physical elements were assembled, a technical surveillance specialist named Kenji was brought in from the state police. His job was to turn a remote clearing in the woods into a high-tech observation post. Kenji's equipment was the stuff of spy movies. He had an arsenal of tiny, night vision-capable pinhole cameras designed to be embedded in tree trunks, their lenses no bigger than a screw head. He had passive infrared motion sensors that could distinguish between a human being and a deer, programmed to send silent alerts. He had directional microphones, sensitive enough to pick up a whisper from 50 yards away. Everything was wireless, battery-operated with solar trickle chargers, and connected via a discrete, encrypted satellite uplink to a mobile command unit. 2 nights later, under the cover of a moonless sky, the operation commenced. A team of 12 hand-picked officers and technicians, their faces darkened with camouflage paint, began the arduous hike back towards Caleb's cabin. They moved with the silent, practiced efficiency of a special forces unit. Ethan was not with them this time. He was at the command post with Harding, a decision made for both his safety and the integrity of the mission. The team reached the clearing, a small, natural meadow about half a mile from Caleb's cabin just after 2 a.m., and began their strange theatrical work. The Ford Explorer was carefully rolled off a small trailer and positioned in the center of the clearing, its hood slightly ajar as if it had broken down. The team then placed the mannequin family inside, arranging them in poses of casual distress. The father was positioned to be looking at a map under the dim glow of the dome light. The mother stared out the window. Chloe was in the back, her head resting against the glass. While the car was being set, Kenji and his assistant moved through the surrounding trees like ghosts, drilling tiny holes, embedding cameras, and burying sensor wires under the leaf litter. They field-tested every piece of equipment, ensuring every angle of the clearing was under constant invisible surveillance. By 4 a.m., they were finished. They meticulously swept the area for footprints, erasing any sign of their presence. Then they melted back into the forest, leaving behind a scene of profound and eerie silence. A lonely car, a lost family, and a trap baited with memory. The mobile command unit, a large, windowless van packed with humming electronics, was parked at the same hidden turnout at the base of the mountain. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Harding, Sheriff Thompson, Ethan, and Kenji sat before a bank of high-definition monitors, each displaying a different view of the clearing. The wait began. Day 1 was an exercise in extreme patience. The sun rose, flooding the clearing with light. On the monitors, the scene remained static, a perfect, silent diorama. They watched squirrels chase each other across the hood of the car. They saw a flock of wild turkeys wander through, oblivious. Every hour that passed felt like a day. Ethan paced the confined space of the van like a caged animal, his body thrumming with a mixture of hope and dread. Harding sat perfectly still in his chair, a thermos of black coffee in hand, his eyes never leaving the screens. He knew this was a psychological game, and Caleb Thorne had all the time in the world. As dusk fell, Kenji switched the monitors to the ethereal green glow of the night vision cameras. The familiar clearing was transformed into a ghostly alien landscape. The directional microphones amplified the sounds of the forest into an unnerving symphony. The distant hoot of an owl, the chittering of unseen creatures, the rustle of leaves in the wind. At 11:42 p.m., a jolt of adrenaline shot through the van. A large doe and her fawn stepped cautiously into the clearing. They approached the car, their ears twitching. The doe sniffed at a tire. Then, seemingly spooked by the unnatural object, she snorted and bounded away, her fawn close behind. The team let out a collective, shaky breath, a false alarm. Day 2 dawned with no change. The vigil continued. The psychological toll of the wait was immense. The team began to work in shifts, but Ethan refused to leave his post. He sat beside Harding, the two of them sharing a rare moment of quiet conversation. Ethan talked about his sister, not as a victim, but as the vibrant, funny person she was. He told Harding about the time she'd tried to teach him to bake a cake, and they'd ended up covering the entire kitchen in flour. Harding in turn spoke of his early days as a deputy, of the weight of a case like this on a small community. In the strange intimacy of the surveillance van, as they waited for a monster to appear, they mourned the family he had taken. The sun set on the second day. The forest on the screens turned green once more. The mood in the van was somber. Doubt, a quiet and insidious poison, was beginning to creep in. Had Caleb seen them? Had he simply moved on, deeper into the mountains? Was this all for nothing? Kenji was monitoring the equipment, preparing to hand off to the night shift operator. Ethan was staring blankly at the main screen, the image of the silent car now seared into his brain. Suddenly, Kenji stiffened. He didn't say a word, just raised a single finger, tapping the screen of his diagnostic laptop. "What is it?" Harding asked, his voice sharp. "Motion sensor," Kenji whispered, his eyes wide. "Perimeter north." It just tripped. Harding and the sheriff leaned in, their eyes glued to the monitor that covered the northern edge of the clearing. The view was partially obscured by the thick trunk of an oak tree, but something was there. A flicker of movement in the deepest shadows, just beyond the reach of the infrared illuminators. It was impossible to make out a shape. It could be another deer. It could be a bear. But it was moving with a slow, deliberate purpose that was neither animal nor random. It was the movement of something that was watching, something that was thinking. The forest was no longer empty. The ghost had come home. Here is the second and final 2,000-word part of Act 4, which details the capture, the chilling confession, and the final discovery. Act 4, Breakthrough and Confrontation, Part 2 of 2. Inside the mobile command unit, the world had shrunk to the green-hued images on the monitors. The silent alert from the motion sensor had sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through the team, and now they watched, holding their collective breath. The movement in the shadows at the edge of the clearing was slow, patient, and deliberate. It was not the random wandering of a deer. It was the cautious appraisal of a predator. After several long minutes that felt like a lifetime, a figure detached itself from the darkness of the tree line. It was Caleb Thorne. The night vision cameras rendered him in ghostly shades of green and black. He was gaunt, almost skeletal, with a long, matted gray beard that reached his chest. His clothes were a patchwork of animal hides and faded fabric, but it was his eyes that were most arresting. Even on the grainy monitor, they seemed to glow with a wild, feral intensity. He was the physical embodiment of the mountain's deepest isolation, a man who looked more like a part of the forest than a visitor to it. He did not rush towards the bait. For nearly half an hour, he circled the perimeter of the clearing, moving with a supernatural stealth from shadow to shadow, using the thick trunks of the ancient trees for cover. He was a ghost surveying, a disturbance in his realm. The team in the van was frozen, their own breathing seeming thunderously loud in the tense silence. This was the critical test. If Caleb sensed anything was wrong misplaced branch, a patch of disturbed earth, he would vanish back into the night, and the opportunity would be lost forever. Finally, seemingly satisfied that the scene was safe, he stepped out into the open meadow. He approached the Ford Explorer not with aggression, but with a strange, almost reverent curiosity. He didn't look at it like a car, but like an artifact, a memory that had inexplicably materialized in his world. The high-resolution cameras captured every detail as he ran a long, dirt-caked finger along the cool metal of the fender. He pressed his face close to the driver's side window, peering inside at the silent, plastic family. The directional microphones picked up the sound of his ragged breathing. A strange, low grunt escaped his lips, a sound of recognition, perhaps, or deep confusion. He was completely captivated by the scene, lost in a moment that only he could understand. His back was to the woods. Inside the command van, Harding raised a hand, then brought it down sharply. Now, he whispered into his radio. "Go." The arrest was a masterpiece of silent, overwhelming force. From all sides of the clearing, the tactical team emerged from the darkness. They didn't shout or run. They simply rose from the earth like specters, closing the distance in seconds. Caleb heard them at the last moment. He spun around, his wild eyes wide with shock and bewilderment. Before he could even process the threat, he was pinned, powerful hands neutralizing his arms, forcing him to the ground. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. The legendary dangerous hermit of Blackwood Mountain, the man who had haunted the county's imagination for decades, offered no resistance at all. He seemed less like a cornered animal and more like a confused ghost, suddenly confronted by a world he no longer recognized. The capture was swift, silent, and anticlimactic. Within a minute, Caleb Thorne was in handcuffs, the silent forest his only witness. The interrogation took place in a small windowless room at the sheriff's department, a sterile white box that was the complete antithesis of Caleb's entire existence. He sat at a bare metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him. Under the harsh hum of the fluorescent lights, he looked small, frail, and profoundly out of place. His wildness seemed to have been stripped from him, leaving only a hollow, empty shell. From behind the one-way mirror, Ethan Hayes watched, his heart pounding. Detective Harding stood beside him, his expression unreadable. For the first 2 hours, a pair of experienced interrogators tried every technique in the book. They were patient, they were aggressive, they were empathetic. It made no difference. Caleb Thorne was unreachable. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. He did not speak. He did not move. He did not acknowledge their presence in any way. He had retreated into the vast, silent wilderness of his own mind. "It's no good," the lead interrogator said to Harding outside the room. "It's like talking to a stone. I don't think he's heard a word we've said." Harding nodded slowly. "Let me try something," he said. He entered the room alone, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't sit opposite Caleb. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat beside him, as if they were two men sharing a quiet moment. He didn't speak. He reached into a small evidence box he had brought with him, and he placed a single object on the gray metal table. He pushed it gently into the center, directly in Caleb's line of sight. It was the original faceless wooden doll, the one found in the miller's car. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then, slowly, as if drawn by an invisible force, Caleb's gaze shifted from the wall to the doll. His eyes, which had been vacant and distant, suddenly focused. A flicker of recognition, of memory, ignited within them. With a trembling, almost palsied movement, he raised a cuffed hand and extended a single finger, gently touching the doll's smooth, featureless head. "You made this, didn't you, Caleb?" Harding asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb's throat worked, his dry lips parting. A sound emerged, a rasping, unused croak that was the first noise he had made since his capture. She was crying," he whispered. The words, though faint, landed in the silent room with the force of a thunderclap. Harding felt a chill run down his spine. He leaned in, his voice remaining gentle, coaxing. "Who was crying, Caleb? Tell me about her. Tell me what happened." And then the dam broke. The story spilled out of Caleb Thorne, not in a coherent narrative, but in a torrent of fragmented memories and paranoid justifications, a glimpse into a mind warped by trauma and isolation. He told them of that night in 1996. He was on one of his nightly patrols of his mountain, his sanctuary, when he saw the flicker of their headlights on a path where they did not belong. They were intruders, trespassers. He tracked them, watching as their car got stuck in the mud of an old, disused logging trail. He confronted them. The man. "He tried to talk to me," Caleb rasped, his eyes seeing a memory on the table. He smiled. He said they were lost. The outside world, always smiling. Always lying. In his paranoid worldview, Robert Miller's friendly demeanor was a trick, a deception to lull his guard before they defiled his home. He produced an old rusty shotgun and forced them to drive their car deeper into the woods, down the path that led to the hidden rock crevice. "I told them they had to stay the night," Caleb explained. "The mountain needed to be quiet. They were too loud. I told them I would let them go when the sun came up." He had spent part of that night in his cabin, carving the doll. It was a gift, a peace offering for the little girl Chloe to stop her whimpering. But when he presented it to her, she didn't stop crying. She screamed. Her terror of the faceless object was something his broken mind could not comprehend. It was a rejection of his world, of him. "She just kept crying," he repeated, his voice taking on a pained, whining tone. "The noise. It hurts the trees. It scares the animals. It doesn't belong here." His agitation grew as he relived the memory. "I had to make it stop. I had to make them all stop. The noise had to stop." The mountain needs its silence. It needs to be quiet. He didn't give the graphic details of the murders. He didn't have to. The motive was laid bare in all its horrifying, twisted logic. He hadn't killed them for money, or for pleasure, or even out of anger. He had killed them because in his mind they were a source of discordant noise in a sacred place. He had snuffed out their lives to restore the perfect, silent order of his sanctuary. In the aftermath of the confession, a strange calm settled over Caleb. He was spent, the ghosts of his past finally exorcised into the open. Harding, working with the district attorney, offered him a final stark choice. If he showed them where he had buried the Miller family, he would be spared the death penalty. He would spend the rest of his life in a secure psychiatric facility, a world of quiet rooms and medication, rather than the violent chaos of a maximum security prison. Caleb agreed without hesitation. The final act of the long drama took place the next day, back on Blackwood Mountain. A convoy, much smaller and more somber than the first, drove Caleb up the familiar road. Ethan was there, keeping his distance, his face an unreadable mask of grief. Caleb, now in an orange jumpsuit, led the team on foot, not to the ravine where the car was found, but to a different location a mile to the east. He led them to a small, beautiful waterfall that cascaded over a wall of moss-covered rock into a clear pool below. He pointed a shackled hand towards the waterfall itself. Behind the water, he said, 2 investigators, equipped with powerful flashlights, carefully made their way behind the curtain of falling water. They found a small, hidden opening, an entrance to a dry, shallow cave that was completely invisible from the outside. The forensic team followed them in. A few minutes later, one of them emerged, his face pale. He nodded once to Detective Harding. They had found them. Due to the cave's unique conditions, cold, dry, and protected from the elements and animals, the remains of Robert, Linda, and Chloe Miller were remarkably preserved. After 20 long years, they had finally been recovered. As the forensic team began the slow, respectful process of carrying the remains out of the cave, Ethan Hayes stood by a tree and watched. There was no sense of victory, no feeling of triumph. The monster was caught. The truth was known, but nothing could bring them back. All that remained was a profound, soul-crushing sadness, and the quiet, agonizing relief of a 20-year question finally being answered. The long confrontation was over. The silence on the mountain was, at last, complete. The trial of Caleb Thorne was not the dramatic courtroom battle some might have expected. There were no surprise witnesses, no shouted objections, no moment of shocking revelation from the stand. The evidence presented by the prosecution was so overwhelming, so complete, that the proceedings took on the quiet, somber air of a formality of final, necessary ritual to close a wound that had been open for 20 years. The confession, the forensic evidence from the car, the discovery of the bodies, and the chilling tableau of his workshop all painted a picture so absolute that Caleb's guilt was never in question. The trial's central focus, therefore, became not if he was guilty, but why. The key testimony came from a court-appointed forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Alistair Finch, who had spent dozens of hours interviewing Caleb. On the stand, Dr. Finch explained Caleb's fractured reality to the jury in calm, clinical terms. He described how the severe traumatic brain injury Caleb suffered as a child, combined with the psychological trauma of witnessing his brother's death, had laid the foundation for a severe paranoid disorder. Mr. Thorne's extreme lifelong isolation exacerbated his condition exponentially, Dr. Finch testified, his voice resonating in the quiet courtroom. He developed a pathological attachment to the mountain, viewing it not as property, but as a living extension of himself. In his mind, the wilderness was a sanctuary of perfect, natural order and silence. The Miller family, through no fault of their own, did not register to him as fellow human beings in need of help. They registered as a violation. Their presence, their vehicle, their voices, and most acutely their daughter's crying, were perceived by his damaged mind as a source of painful, chaotic noise that threatened the very fabric of his reality. His actions, while monstrous in their outcome, were, from his perspective, a desperate attempt to restore order, to silence the intrusion and protect his sanctuary. Throughout the testimony, Caleb himself sat beside his public defender, a passive, detached figure. He seemed utterly disconnected from the proceedings, a ghost from another century lost in the machinery of modern justice. He stared at his hands, occasionally looking up at the ceiling as if the discussion of his life, his crimes, and his broken mind had nothing to do with him. Ethan Hayes sat in the front row of the gallery every single day of the trial. He watched the man who had destroyed his world, and he felt none of the righteous fury he had expected. Seeing Caleb in the flesh, under the sterile courtroom lights, was a disarming experience. The monster he had imagined for 2 decades a cunning, evil force of nature was, in reality, a frail, sick, and pathetic old man. The creature who had haunted his nightmares was, in the light of day, simply a broken human being. When the jury returned with the inevitable verdict of guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder, there were no gasps in the courtroom. When the judge, foregoing the death penalty due to Caleb's clear psychiatric state, sentenced him to 3 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security psychiatric facility without the possibility of parole, there was no applause. Justice, in this case, was not a moment of triumph. It was the quiet, administrative act of closing a door, of ensuring that the ghost of Blackwood Mountain would never haunt its slopes again. As Caleb was led away, his eyes briefly met Ethan's. There was no recognition in them, no malice, no remorse. There was nothing. And in that empty gaze Ethan finally understood. He felt no satisfaction, no elation. The anger that had been a burning coal inside him for half his life had cooled, leaving behind only the fine gray ash of sorrow. The immense crushing weight of 20 years of not knowing had finally lifted, but it didn't leave him feeling lighter. It left him feeling hollow, and for the first time, truly and completely, alone with his grief. The months following the trial were a difficult, aimless period for Ethan. The singular, driving purpose that had consumed him, the search for answers, was gone. He had spent so long defined by his quest that he no longer knew who he was without it. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, ready to chase down a lead that no longer existed. The grief, which had been sharpened and focused by anger, now returned in its original sprawling form, a vast, empty ocean of loss. Seeking solace, he turned back to the things his sister had left behind. He reread her journals, not as a detective looking for clues, but as a brother trying to hear her voice again. He looked through the family photo albums, and this time he saw not victims, but people radiant with life. He saw his brother-in-law Robert's passion for the outdoors, his sister Linda's deep belief in community and kindness, and his niece Chloe's boundless joy for the world. He realized that to truly honor them, he could no longer look back at the darkness of their final moments. He had to look forward, using their light as his guide. A new purpose began to take root in the barren soil of his grief. 1 year later, almost to the day of the trial's conclusion, Ethan Hayes stood once again at the foot of Blackwood Mountain. He was a different man. The haunted, restless energy was gone, replaced by a quiet strength and a clear sense of purpose. He was not alone. He stood before a small crowd of local journalists, community members, and Park Service officials. Behind him, a newly erected memorial stood, carved from simple, elegant gray granite. The sun glinted off the polished stone. "My family came to this mountain seeking beauty and adventure," Ethan began, his voice clear and steady. "They were experienced and prepared, but they were defeated by a simple lack of a signal, by the silence of a place too remote for help to hear them. For the past year, I've worked to ensure that no other family has to face that same silence alone." He went on to announce the official launch of the Miller Fund for Wilderness Safety. It was a non-profit foundation dedicated to providing subsidized personal locator beacons and satellite messengers to hikers and travelers entering remote areas across the country. The fund would also work with local authorities to install better safety signage and emergency call boxes on notoriously dangerous rural roads, like the one that wound its way up Blackwood Mountain. "My family's story ended in darkness," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion but unbroken. "My hope, my mission, is that their legacy can be one of light, a signal that cuts through the wilderness and leads people safely home." He gestured to the memorial behind him. "This stone is here to remember. On it were carved the names Robert, Linda, and Chloe Miller. But beneath their names, Ethan had insisted on adding others: Daniel Carruthers, Sarah and Ben Carter. The inscription at the bottom read, "In memory of all who were lost to the silence of this mountain, may they find peace in the light." Later that evening, long after the small crowd had dispersed, Ethan stood alone before the memorial. The setting sun bathed the peaks of Blackwood Mountain in a warm, golden glow. It no longer looked like a menacing, dark fortress. It was just a mountain beautiful, majestic, and indifferent. Its power was in its wildness, not in any malice. The monster that had stalked its slopes was born of human frailty, not of the mountain itself. Ethan reached down and placed a single perfect pink rose at the base of the stone for Chloe. He looked at her name, and for the first time a genuine bittersweet smile touched his lips. He had taken the ugliest, most painful chapter of his life, and had used it to build something that would protect others, something his sister Linda would have been proud of. He had honored his family, not by endlessly reliving their deaths, but by celebrating the spirit of their lives. He stood there for a long moment, then turned his back to the memorial and the mountain. He walked away from the trailhead, towards his car, his shadow long in the fading light. He was no longer chasing ghosts or running from the past. The long confrontation was over. He had found the answers, he had seen justice done, and he had built a legacy. And now at last he was walking toward his own future, leaving the silence of the mountain behind him. The story of the Miller family in the end is a testament to the enduring, stubborn power of love against the silence of time. It's a story about the perseverance of one man, Ethan Hayes, whose refusal to let his family be forgotten kept a cold case alive in his heart long after it had been officially closed. His two-decade vigil is a profound reminder that for the families of the missing, the search never truly ends. It is also a story about how the present can reach back to unlock the past. It's a story of technology of a drone flown by a curious blogger that saw what a generation of searching could not. Alex Carter's discovery was a 1 in a billion chance, a digital eye in the sky that pierced through the veil of time and nature, proving that no secret, no matter how deeply buried, is ever truly safe forever. But beneath the mystery and the breakthrough, this is also a deeply human tragedy. It's a cautionary tale about the unseen horrors that can fester in the dark, forgotten corners of our world. The story of Caleb Thorne is not one of simple evil, but of a mind shattered by trauma and left to decay in absolute isolation. It's a harrowing look at how a human being, stripped of connection and left alone with his ghosts, can become a monster, his reality so twisted that the sound of a child's cry becomes a violation worthy of silencing. The silence he craved on the mountain was ultimately a reflection of the profound silence in his own soul. This brings us to our final image, 1 year after the trial. Ethan Hayes stands alone before the granite memorial at the base of Blackwood Mountain. The sun is setting, casting a warm, golden light across the peaks, rendering them beautiful and serene. The mountain is no longer a fortress of dread, but simply a place of immense natural peace. The ghosts have been laid to rest. He steps forward and gently traces the names of his family carved into the stone: Robert, Linda, Chloe. His expression is not one of anguish, but of quiet acceptance. Reaching down, he places a single, perfect pink rose at the base of the stona, simple, beautiful gesture of love for a little girl, untainted by the dark symbolism of the past. He looks up at the mountain one last time, and a sad, gentle smile touches his lips. It is not the smile of happiness, but of peace. The kind of peace that comes only after a long and terrible war has finally ended. He has found the answers, he has seen justice served, and he has built a lasting legacy of light from an unimaginable darkness. And with that he turns. He walks away from the memorial, away from the mountain, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. He doesn't look back. The camera holds on the rose, a single spot of vibrant color against the stone. A final, silent testament to a love that never gave up, before the screen at last fades to black.